Hi there, here we are. Week 9. It's an amazing feeling to see the end in sight, but also to be able to see a week's break. Hopefully you'll get a chance to chill out a little bit, but also maybe to catch up. That's a good use of time, because catching up is kind of like having a break, because you're not feeling so stressed by feeling that you're behind in everything. So, what can we say? Well, first of all, we've got this awesome image as the backdrop to this particular slide. It's from a piece of art by an extraordinary English visionary poet and painter, printmaker, William Blake. So go and look him up if you've never heard of William Blake. Just do a Google search for images, but then also look for his poetry, which is some of the sort of most cited little bits of poetry in the English language are probably from William Blake, in actual fact. To see the world in a grain of sand, for instance, is one from one of his poems. Here, of course, I've chosen this image because it's very much about the image of man, very male, as measurer, as a calculator, as a person or being, almost a god who can calculate and measure the world. And of course, this is something that is very much key to the concept of being modern, that we actually are in control of things, that we can measure and manage, label and analyze, and all those things which, have defined what it means to be a modern human being, a modern Western human being particularly. But of course, we've exported that image of modernity all over the globe, and it is now definitional of what it means to be part of a global community, all of whom can measure and so on. But it belies something, that's our incredible ongoing vulnerability. And I think that's something that sits in the background as we head towards the last weeks of this course, is the incredible vulnerability, the fragility, as David Christian would say, of complex systems. So we're looking at revolution, and in order to look at revolution, I've chosen to look at key individuals that sort of represent revolution in the cultural sphere. That's Beethoven and Mozart, and so a quick peek behind the scenes with Napoleon and his nemesis, the Duke of Wellington, and so on. But in order to capture that sense of heroism that I think defines the image, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, of this project of becoming modern, that it was a heroic project, a glorious project, a project that required courage and strength and immense will and dedication and focus and commitment. These are all things that sit behind the modern story. And we have to understand that it is a story. It is an imagined order. Thresholds and the citizen get woven in here, but the main story really is this idea that humanity is engaged in a great project, and it takes all of our courage and imagination and will and cleverness, the smarts, to harness technologies to reshape human destiny and the planet. So let's get moving. So what can we say first of all? All right. So you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Rapid change, which is what actually typifies the last 2.5 to 3 centuries of the human experience, equals revolution. So this revolution has reshaped every aspect, I think, of human society, and it has impacted all cultures, both positively and negatively in different ways. So a little bit about energy regimes. I touched on these last week, but I want to give you a definition here and a little bit of an insight into how energy is being understood in the modern sense, particularly. And this is important because, I'm not going to touch very much on energy across this lecture, but I wanted to sort of cement this idea that an energy regime is a coherent system of energy flows around which identity, purpose, and activity all hinge. So I was carrying on about, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay and all that sort of stuff. in the previous lecture, and it's I was doing it, and I actually made it quite explicit that the Monty Python spoof was actually, of course, with Monty Python, very clever, recognizing that our identities, though we might be a lumberjack, can be complex, complicated, and even transgressive. So that's there. But what we do and how we do it, it hinges on all our activities around increasing, maximizing, shaping the energy flows around us. So to be a lumberjack, ending the last lecture with huge chainsaws or saws getting bigger and bigger and bigger, to build on that sense that humanity as a whole has crafted a new modern identity around how we manage our energy regimes. Within that, of course, there are subcomponents of identity, all built around human activity. So let's have a look at a definition. And because I'm using quite a number of papers and books and so on that you don't have at your fingertips, all the references are actually below the slide, so you'll find them there. So you got to understand, I want to get this across to you. We understand that the authors that industrialization process as a qualitative transition which transforms the agrarian socio-ecological regime, so it was an agrarian socio-ecological regime, into an industrial regime. If you're not sure what regime is, it's essentially an organizing principle built around a relationship to energy, complexity, but also power and where power sits. Okay, and it also was about energy. It tells us who we are within that organization or imagined order. So it's transferred the agrarian socio-ecological regime into an industrial one, thereby establishing a distinct and fundamentally new pattern of society-nature interaction and the material and energy use. So it's all built around the ways that we are expressing ourselves. So talking about expressing oneself, you're probably all familiar with this guy's mugshot, Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the most extraordinarily creative musical geniuses of Western history. And of course, there were probably many just as creative and amazing folk who existed in the past that we know nothing about, simply because of lack of records and so on. But Beethoven is, a pin-up god for the Romantic period. He's also a pin-up god for all that represents titanic human endeavor against all odds, his deafness and so on. So let's look at this. So there's a myth around Beethoven. He's a cultural icon. He's not just an individual who lived in Vienna, between 1770 and 1827. He's much more than that. He represents something mythological at the very heart of this creative human enterprise that we would call Western modernity. Oops. Well, I'll keep him there. There's an independence and individuality about him. He was a very powerful individual. He had quite a strong anti-authoritarian streak in him. He thought Napoleon was wonderful at first by sort of galvanizing Europe and bringing about a new relationship with science and so on. But when Napoleon made himself emperor and seemed to lose the plot from Beethoven's perspective, Beethoven lost all confidence in the sort of French experiment with republicanism and then a new form of authoritarianism being Napoleonic imperialism. Okay, and he took quite great risks. He refused to bow or acknowledge Napoleon when Napoleon drove past him in a carriage, whereas his mate, he was out there with another very, very famous German philosopher and poet called Goethe, and Goethe bowed down, but Goethe was 10, 20 years Beethoven's senior, and very much lived in a different world. But Beethoven refused to bow to Napoleon, and Napoleon told a couple of guards who wanted to go and clip him about the ears, no, leave him alone. He's Beethoven. He's entitled to his own opinion. Still says something interesting about Napoleon too, I think. So what else? So I've already mentioned he's deaf, and I guess you know that. He composed for the last 25 years of his life, essentially in total and absolute deafness. Many interesting stories about Beethoven during that period, like he cut off the legs off his piano, so it sat on the floor, and he would lie on his stomach playing the piano so he could feel the vibrations through his chest and so on like that. I don't actually know if that's true or not, but great stories. He also liked 43 beans of coffee, and he would count them out and grind them up every day. He had one coffee which he ground up, and and that one is a true story, that he loved his coffee, but he would have no more or no less. So he rationed his beans. I like that. Now, you may never have heard of Prometheus, but there is a Promethean quality to Beethoven. Prometheus is the ancient Greek Titan, a mythic character, not a god. He was a Titan who came before the gods, and Prometheus was given the job of looking after humanity by Zeus, but Zeus forbade Prometheus to give humanity fire. So Prometheus fell in love with humanity and thought, these guys are going to get nowhere without fire. We know that fire is the second technology, don't we? And we know that without fire, we wouldn't have had barbecues and therefore big brains. Prometheus gave us, our species, fire, and he was chained to the Caucasus Mountains as a result. I think it was the Caucasus one. Might be the wrong mountains chain, but he was chained up there, and an eagle every day for about 10,000 years came and ate his kidneys or liver, and had a great time. Prometheus, of course, it hurt over the day. It healed, but Prometheus's sacrifice, his endurance for humanity, is kind of given Prometheus this kind of mythic status. And the human potentiality of culture linked with technology, because what Prometheus gave humanity by giving them fire was he gave us technology. Okay, he gave us the ability and the wits to use technology to create more and more abundant and diverse energy flows, creates more complexity. In other words, Prometheus mythically kicked off the human story as a civilization story. So Beethoven's been compared to Prometheus. Okay, Beethoven was also a great believer in humanity, and so he was a nationalist in some respects, but really, if I was going to put my money on it, I'd say he was more of an internationalist. He believed in the brotherhood of man, as it was called back then. He was quite a radical humanist, and his very famous song from the Ninth Symphony that goes da 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 da. Next slide, which is now I might as well jump there. Hey, the Anthem for the EU is a poem that speaks of hope and of the better side of humanity. It's an aspirational poem, so it's one of the reasons why the EU, who knows that it's already lost Great Britain just recently, it knows how difficult it is to hold people together when we have such differences of language and cultural backgrounds and so on. They chose that anthem because it aspires to the brotherhood, or to the community, to the human community, what we would call the global citizenship of all people. So it's very interesting that they chose that particular piece of music from the Ninth Symphony. That was my favourite symphony as a kid. I can remember the first time I heard it. The hairs on my head stood up. It probably won't have that effect on you, but I had more hair back then. Anyway, this is a YouTube clip. It's active. You can see you might be able to see the little finger pointing there saying it's active. I'm not going to click on it because I will get copyright struck, no doubt. So I'm going to keep moving. So let's keep looking at this heroic individual then, because the isolated and heroic individual is something that typifies modernity. The whole of our consumer culture is built around us being individuals, and we can look at how that gets expressed in anti-vaxxers, anti-masks, anti-lockdown folk, but much more broadly than that. Of course, we can extrapolate it out to looking at the entirety of the way our consumer culture is based and built. Okay, it's performed around Facebook, the individual face, my face, and so on. So we have this amazing painting here. Some of you may recognize it. It's an absolute classic for me, and it says so much because it's the Wanderer above the sea of fog. But you look at this very civilized gentleman. He's wearing a full suit. He possibly has a hat in the hand that's not holding the cane, and he's looking out over that wild, tempestuous, mysterious world. And that's the world that across the 19th and 20th century human beings have worked so hard to dominate and to reshape. So there's an archetypal quality to this. This is an imagined order. And there's also a compelling narrative there. It is one of splendid isolation of the individual, me. It's all about me. It's not about us so much. Trying to reframe that, and which of course is the new emergent story, I would argue. It's that attempt to reframe it that, of course, like this is all I guess it's aiming towards. That's what I'm trying to say. It's aiming towards a new story, a story that David Christian and many others are working, tirelessly to seed and to structure and to build, this compelling story of energy, complexity, and collective learning. It's the collective that they're emphasizing. It's the fact that we co-evolve with natural phenomena, that we do not exist outside of our relationships, and that's the new story. So to me, we're trying to challenge this story, this splendid isolation story, which of course, anybody who stood on the top of a mountain or at somewhere like this, looking out at any splendid scene, can feel that expansion that comes from that, the personal satisfaction. But we need to understand that we are not in a vacuum when we're doing that. This is not the whole story, one might say. This is one component of a much more interesting and complex story of what it means to be human. So, heroic figures, here are two. Good old Napoleon and good old Wellington. Okay, so both of them are dominator types. They both represent certain visions of social order. And and of course, social order means it's code for politics, right? So let's have a look at the politics of music, because I'm going to briefly touch on that. So we've got classicism. The classical world is the world of Louis XVIII and Marie Antoinette. It's the world of Charles the First of England and so on, who got his head cut off. It's the world of George III, who was thought he could walk over the American settlers and got kicked in the guts for trying to do so, and led to the War of Independence and the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It's about order, and everybody knows where they are in that order. Whereas there's this disorder of romanticism, which is the disorder that Beethoven represents. It's the disorder that Caspar Friedrichs was capturing in that image of the gentleman looking out over the disorder of the universe. You could say there's creative disorder, and that is, what we think of as capitalism, or we can think of it as capitalism. Capitalism is about not stable companies that just keep doing the same thing over and over again. It's about the emergence of the constantly new, and that chasing of the constantly new is a new aesthetic. This smartphone, has evolved rapidly over the last 20 years, and so on. There's a new sense of identity. If you the mobile phone has been the most rapidly adopted piece of technology in the entire history of humanity. Street kids in India have smartphones or mobile phones of some kind, depending on how absolutely poverty struck they are. They will have it in preference to a house or a roof over their heads, or even a meal. So there's a new way of ordering the social, and I want to quickly represent that through a contrast between Mozart and Beethoven. So here we have good old Mozart. Mozart's the child prodigy who was knocking out symphonies when he was about 8 or 9. He lived fast and he died young. Quite an extraordinary individual, and some of the most sublime music you can ever come across. One example of which is this. But if we contrast him with good old Beethoven, there's his mugshot again. So Beethoven, you can see there's absolute order, precision, and this is also found in Mozart's music. His music is the music of the Ancien Régime, of that classical period. He was a classicist, and he took classicism to its absolutely pinnacle, okay? And so there's a sample of his music there. I love the Symphony Number 40, first movement, so you can have a listen to that if you want to stretch your ears a little bit and your musical awareness. Beethoven here. Now, the difference between Mozart and Beethoven was Mozart worked for cash, but he was stuck within a patronage system. And that patronage system didn't want to let go of him. So it punished Mozart when he told his patrons to get stuffed, really. And, he was forced to work really innovatively. That's the word. He was forced to work innovatively in the creation and production of operas, which suddenly, as he was on his deathbed, actually, his first absolutely incredible success, The Magic Flute, was airing. And, it would have changed his entire life experience after that, because he would have become a millionaire type person as a result of the success of that particular opera. Unfortunately, he never recovered from his illness, and his wife and child just disappear into the mists, because we actually do not know what happened to those two. Beethoven, on the other hand, never had a wife or child. He was too ugly and grumpy, poor guy, and he kept on falling in love with people he could never marry, simply because they were above him in status. So Beethoven had this chip on his shoulder, you probably can see it there, and he composed really passionate, intense pieces of music, such as this one, ba-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. Okay, I'm letting you listen to these because, of course, I don't want to get copyright struck for a YouTube breach. But Beethoven's world was quite different, because he was born 14 years after Mozart, and in that 14 years something happened. The politics of music and aesthetics was changing. Why? Because there was a new middle class emerging who actually could afford to have a Mozart in their back pocket. It was no longer something that the aristocrats had a monopoly on. And the aristocrats turned to people like Beethoven as intellectual emissaries that would actually separate them from these uncouth supporters of what was very rapidly becoming old-fashioned music. It's interesting to see that suddenly music would go out of fashion. By the time that Mozart was composing, Johann Sebastian Bach, who had died only 6 years before Mozart was born, was already almost forgotten. Mozart didn't forget him. Beethoven didn't forget him. They actually studied Bach's music very carefully and learned from it. But the majority of people saw Bach as very, very out of date. Mozart rapidly became out of date, and it was really the 19th century composers, starting off with people like Beethoven, that reshaped the aesthetic of the modern world. So, having touched on all of that, and given you a sense that we can look to the cultural world of the early industrial period and see stories like the story of the contrast between a Mozart and a Beethoven happening all over the place. We can see it also in literature, we can see it in the visual arts, but also in politics. The difference between the politics of a Napoleon and a very conservative, I have to say, Wellington, who was quite happy to shoot Brits if they got out of place as well. So he was an authoritarian in many ways as well, but he was an authoritarian that worked within the political boundaries of a democratic monarchy, whereas the absolutism of Napoleon Bonaparte's image, or vision, should I say, of the world was rapidly becoming out of date and anachronistic. So new knowledge, what was happening? Well, a few things can be said. This is the period where rationalism and enlightenment really take off. These are both, you can look them up on Wikipedia or whatever if you want to know more about them, but these are projects that emphasize the importance of the mind, of intellectual endeavor, of clear logical thinking, of seeing the world objectively, and of shaping knowledge in ways that, we're going to reflect essentially what we would call now the scientific model, the scientific method. The Enlightenment was about understanding the world through our intellect. And this was when the concept of the encyclopedia, for instance, was first worked upon. And the French rationalists and Enlightenment thinkers were trying to make an encyclopedia of all human knowledge. Totally. Even then, that was impossible. But it was, of course, for them, it was all European human knowledge because it seemed better to them than the knowledge of other peoples. But even so, an encyclopedia is simply an attempt to collate and organise knowledge in ways that are accessible. It's no longer any attempt to have the entirety of universal knowledge captured in there. One of the things that really was under attack was superstition of all kinds, including, for many Enlightenment and rationalists, philosophers, Christianity itself. Okay. Why? Because the wars between various Christian factions in Europe had led to such bloodshed and such unhappiness and misery that Christianity itself became suspect with the intellectual class. We have this strange case of Isaac Newton. So you look at his dates for a start. So he's at the very beginning of this period. Basically, you could say he's almost born at the at the very end of the Renaissance period. And he lived into a period where the Enlightenment was in full swing. The 18th century could be considered the Enlightenment century. The 17th century you could consider the rationalist century. So, but Newton mixed, like everybody did at that period, and I'm sure people will say that about us, in a few centuries' time. He mixed, the past with the present and the future. So he gave us, of course, some incredibly powerful understandings that have informed physics right up to the present day. We talk about the Newtonian universe governed by gravitational flows and so on. So he gave us, incredibly sophisticated mathematics to describe all of that stuff. But Newton was still very much caught up in what was called alchemy at the time. He believed that, you could turn lead into gold, and he was very, very focused on working on or in the alchemical domain over the entirety of his life. So you have alchemy is something that you would associate with the medieval period, still alive and well during Newton's own time and in his own mind. So he has that side, and then you have this incredibly, what we would think of as scientific rational side, looking at the laws of physics and so on, that Newton's formulated in his famous book, the Principia Mathematica. So Newton is, just like all of us, a complex character. So there's a shift in value, to a critical questioning of traditional institutions and customs and morals. This was all up for grabs, and it led to a whole new era of philosophical thinking, starting off with, Voltaire and people like that, going through poet like Goethe, whom I mentioned before, but also Immanuel Kant and Herder, and then we had I didn't think of my list of philosophers before I came in here. Schopenhauer and people like that, leading up to Karl Marx. Karl Marx took a whole bunch of that stuff and gave it a new form so that it actually stayed as a robust intellectual system right down to the current period, though it's now seen to be politically bankrupt. But that's only because we had useless politicians exploit Marx's ideas for their own goals, people like Stalin and Mao and Lenin and co. All right. So we have a boundary between the physical and the metaphysical. So that's Newton, right? But even so, it's right up into the 19th century when poor old John Snow, he's the guy that sort of generated the use of data or statistics to shape is probably the wrong word. It's to understand the pressures that lead to disease. This is called epidemiology. epidemiologists are working overtime with COVID, of course, but John Snow used mapping and statistics to actually identify cholera-ridden wells in London in the middle of the 19th century, but his peers reckoned it was just rubbish, and they didn't accept anything to do with that. Why? Because miasma, this strange belief that somehow cholera was in the air and it was bad air, was the dominant belief, and it took a number of decades from John Snow's work to the realization or acceptance by the dominant scientific community of the validity of John Snow's methods, by which time the poor guy was dead, so he never got any direct gratification out of that. But it's a very good example of this tension between metaphysical assumptions about the way the world works and what you would call realist assumptions. Okay, so data, that's what John Snow used. Let's look at the father of statistics. Okay, Adolphe Quetelet. He's a really interesting guy. So he used statistics to understand social behavior and variance. Okay, he was a French guy, of course. If you look at that name, he called it social physics, and this was a period, of course, when the early sociologists, any of you doing Philip Ablett's HIS140 will know about this, were working on understanding the social world through scientific method. They felt that there was a science of social world called sociology, and they tried to make it as scientific as possible. We now know that it is actually an interpretive and critical discipline, and not scientific in the way that Quetelet would have wanted. Okay, he called it also anthropometry, which is the measurement of human action, anthropos being human or man. And he says, I strive never to lose sight of those scientific principles which ought to guide the observer in all his investigation. Total science, okay? My aim is not to defend systems or bolster up theories. I confine myself to the citation of facts, okay, such as society presents to our view. So facts that we can see that are observable phenomena in the social world. If these facts be legitimately established, it follows that we must accept of and accommodate our reason to them. In other words, reasoned thinking needs to be molded around the actual evidence, not as in the case of John Snow with the guys who believed in miasma that the evidence was rubbish because this is what is the case. In other words, an intellectual assumption that is actually incorrect. This is, of course, what conspiracy theorists argue about today, that we're all dupes. But since Quetelet's time, we've come a long way. I'm not saying that science has it all worked out. In fact, I've got a critique of science coming up in this particular lecture. Not a bad critique, but it's saying that science takes us only so far in understanding our dance with energy, complexity, and collective learning. So let's keep moving along. But so that's Quetelet. I'm giving you some individual biographies because sometimes these stories actually help us understand what's happening at this period of time. If we could do an entire course, on the 18th century or the 19th century or the transition from agrarian societies into industrial societies and so on. So the nature of this course, I guess I've said it many times, is to step back and get that big picture. But sometimes looking at a guy like this fellow is going to help us see what's happening. And he states what 19th century intellectuals across the board in the West thought. So come back to this idea of coevolution for a moment. So this is really interesting. This image here, this photograph, was taken in Iceland. And I'm just going to pull up, I actually primed it here. I'm going to pull this article up, okay? So this is an article about the world's biggest plant to capture CO2 from the air, okay? It's just opened. It can capture about 4,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, okay? That's minimal, but they give us some very interesting statistics. That by the middle of the century, we're going to have to be pulling about where was it? Oh God, I should have highlighted it. Pulling a vast amount of CO2 from the air. This is an emergent technology, Okay, that's it. I knew it. I wanted to say 1 billion, but I was scared I was going to be find that I had to sort of do a mea culpa. I'm sorry. Next time we have a lecture, I got my stats wrong. But it was pulling nearly 1 billion tons of metric tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year through direct air capture technology, and that's by 2050. So I'm going to pull that down again. So we co-evolve in direct relationship to environmental processes. Sometimes that's stresses like climate change and the problems with global warming and so on. But they've often, as I said in the coevolution talk that I gave a couple of weeks back, we are also evolving through range of co-evolving processes within and across the human spectrum. So this is just one example. So Christian talks about collective learning as an evolutionary tool. So I'm going to try and fit this together. So we've got Christian talking about evolutionary tools. We've got to have good old Charles Darwin talks about evolution, not simply as biological, but also as a moral process. In other words, there's some level of intentionality going on here that we need to be aware of. So evolution is also a moral process. And I think what he means there is that it's a social process, that it's something that we can actively engage with through choice, through awareness of what we're doing. So we can co-evolve with species. Domestication was a good example of co-evolution, in which they domesticate us and we domesticate them. But it's also, of course, the environment. So that's why I thought I'd put this up here. One, I think this was so sexy, I wanted to get it into the lecture somehow. And because, of course, it comes on the tailcoats of me talking about technology last week, for instance. So, there are a bunch of good reasons for having it here. But, so what we've got is a move from the selfish gene to a cooperative gene. And those are two links there that, will explain a little bit more about those concepts if you like them. Because, it's the selfish gene is the way of thinking about modernity and hyper-individualism and so on, which I've started this lecture by talking about. But, as we evolve, that means we change, right? And we change in response to the stresses, the drivers that are occurring in our environment. And I think, whether we like it or not, we're going to be dragged screaming to the altar, you might say, that we have to re-engage with, deeply indigenous principles of the co-creation of the universe and our relational engagement with the world around us. So this is from this book here, The Great Turning, which is a fantastic book. I've had it for over a decade now, used it in my PhD long ago as well. So David Corton, he's got this to say about ordering and order. Okay, that means, in other words, there's a process going on there, and he's looking at this process, and it's always been implicit so far in much of what David Christian's been talking about. But that the laws of the universe, from that sort of govern energy, govern the way that complexities move through these various thresholds, there is a kind of, he calls it in this particular one, intelligence. But there is certainly something in the natural world that drives us in certain directions. So I want you to have a think about this. This is something to take away with. One, because it uses a bunch of the terms that David Christian has used, and he uses them just the same way. So he says this: although science remains captive to the premise that reality can be explained entirely by a combination of chance and material mechanism, okay, the story of creation's unfolding to ever higher levels of complexity and consciousness points to the existence of a profound intelligence engaged in an epic journey of self-discovery. There's a quote relating to this that I'm going to use in a later lecture. Now, this is not a profound intelligence as in sort of creationism. It's not a profound intelligence as in there's a God sitting up there. Reckon he's sort of playing sort of a game like Minecraft, and he's getting us to all run around, on his console. No, it's not that sort of thing. It's just that he's saying that this self-discovery is, in a way, a metaphor that many physicists are using. And he's not a physicist, this guy. He's a social scientist and theorist. But, Michio Kaku and people like that Carl Sagan, they all talked about the universe coming to know itself, and it's coming to know itself through conscious reflection back on it, which is human culture. An interesting proposition, but it certainly is a powerful story, and I think it's one that as global citizens we can understand ourselves better in the world if we understand ourselves as individuals working collectively to come to know the world in a way that we can live in greater levels of harmony, peace, and so on. So that's the middle there. So up to self-discovery. Then he goes on to say, by giving matter the capacity to choose, in other words, not thinking it's just us, it's actually matter, whether it's inert or whether it's living, actually engages with us and we work together. So by giving matter the capacity to choose, life accelerates the pace of this journey. Engaged in cooperative struggle to maintain its choice-making potential against the downward pull of entropy. Second law of thermodynamics. Life exists only in living communities of diverse, mutually interdependent species. For life, partnership's not just an organizing principle, it's not just pure systems working arbitrarily. No, it is its very essence. And that, for me, is a pin-up statement. It's just like that fantastic statement from Karl Marx about all that is solid melts into air. Those sorts of statements. These are statements that capture my imagination, and they give me a map for understanding the more, the more specific processes of history, and so on. So sharing that one with you. So let's look then. Convergent evolution, summaries now because we're towards the end of the lecture. Convergent evolution occurs before thresholds. We've been dealing with that, and we'll look at thresholds even more in coming lectures. Energy regimes drive evolutionary trends. Cultures evolve in the presence of energy regimes. Of course, you change the energy process and the cultures are going to change. Just think of the difference between Chinese culture and Mesopotamian culture, or modern culture, industrial culture, and so on. And convergent drivers drive new levels of complexity. In other words, as we have these convergences occurring, let's say new media, this is the kind of media that I'm using here to talk to you, new energy sources, alternative energies, including the one that I just showcased before in Iceland, where we're carbon capturing from the directly from the air. These lead to new stories about who we are as a species, and obviously as the individuals that work in those spaces. So, talking now about Goldilocks just for a moment, because I think it's really important to take this in right now. A number of you talked about Goldilocks in your essays that I've marked. Stop that. And some of you were a little bit confused about it, so I want to clarify. So Goldilocks is just the right conditions. Not too hot, not too cold. You know the story. I think all of you do. So here we have the habitable zone. It's a space between, in every solar system, where objects, the planets the size of Earth, can exist and experience similar conditions to what we experience here. That means there is a chance that they also may give forms to life, organic life as we understand it. So other places are too hot and others are too cold. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that we, as we approach thresholds, we have a bunch of ingredients, we have Goldilocks conditions, and that leads to new forms of complexity. So the coming together of new forms of energy that stimulate high levels of complexity. Okay, the convergence generates a new state of being. Okay, so you may consider a threshold a transition point. It's an event that creates something completely new. Big History, BH is Big History, straight from their website. Normally I would not cite a website, and I've scolded many of you for doing so in your essays. But this one was just too good for me not to want to use. I thought, it's great. It says what I needed to say. Okay, so a threshold is a transition point. What we experience at the end of the agricultural period as we move into the industrial period is an incredibly significant threshold. It's a threshold where new sources of energy emerge and link up with other new productive socio-cultural forces, what we would call communication technologies, the printing press, and then later on, of course, in the 20th century, particularly the telecommunicative devices leading up to the wireless devices that we have today with these guys. Okay, so we can see these ingredients at work, and as we cross the threshold, new levels of complexity emerge. This global civilization we've got, new levels of consciousness, awareness that we're global citizens, and of course on top of that, new forms of energy demands on us, and that we need to keep on going, and this belief that growth is what's going to be of a certain kind, material growth, wealth growth, and so on, is the defining feature of modern dynamism and so on. All of these things are coming together, and I think that's really interesting. Take a big breath. About to finish. So I'm sitting over the top of that letter there, so I'm going to move myself over here. I just love this image so much. It comes from an exhibition that I attended in Melbourne. No, it was Canberra. It was Canberra, actually. Yeah, it was Canberra. So this is a period of eclipse for non-Western societies. So Asia and the Western capitalism, they collide. Okay, we have the Opium Wars and other things. Asia is forced, dragged into the modern world. Okay, modern equals capitalism and consumerism. They are definitional, one might say, of this period. The energy quotient momentarily reversed, but as we can see with all this blah 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 and argy-bargy about China and so on, we can see that this is correcting again. Why? Because China is such a massively powerful civilization, society, but just an economic entity as well as a cultural one. And so we can see that China is reclaiming its place in the sun. The epicenter of the entire global economic system and community is shifting, and it's going to shift. It's going to take a century or two for this to for us to see exactly what that means. It doesn't mean China has never had global geopolitical aspirations, so we can assume at the moment that it still doesn't have those, but it does want respect and influence. And the very last slide, Mahatma Gandhi. So while all this is happening, of course, the non-Western world doesn't just sit around and go, oh crikey, what's happening to us? No, it doesn't do that. It finds new ways of dealing with this modern beast, the Western civilization and its industrialization. Gandhi basically told him to F off, and he realized that if he were to resurrect certain traditional economic processes in India that had been suppressed by the British, spinning, for instance, as Indian cotton for Indian clothes, that it would actually really affect British industry back home in the mills, in the spinning mills and so on, and factories, should I say, not mills, factories of industrial Britain. So he harnessed tradition to resist, okay, and he also harnessed other things to do with the other elements of modernity. For instance, the ability to communicate. He was very savvy. He knew how the mass media worked, even back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Remember, he was killed in 1947. He was shot, if you didn't know, by a Hindu radical who felt that Gandhi was being way too nice to Muslim people, because Gandhi was from Gujarat, where there were many Muslim people living. So Gandhi had he was not an essentialist or a fascist or a sort of right-wing nationalist. He cared about people deeply, and of course he was also a pacifist. So anyway, he harnessed traditions to resist. And one of the things that we can call this is defensive modernity. I touched on it at the end of the last lecture when I showed the image of the Japanese industrializing rapidly. Well, here is another example of defensive modernity. And if I'm correct, it's the reading for week 9. If not, it's the reading for week 10. There's a reading on defensive modernity, which we will look at in more detail. All right now, that's me. Thank you very much. and I hope you all have a great break if I don't get to see you, and I'll see you back in week 10, a couple of weeks from now. Remember, of course, the quiz, this one will run across the break, so it will be open for a week longer than normal, just in case you guys not often go to sleep, like some of you seem to keep on doing regarding that quiz in actual fact. That's all from me. See you later. Bye-bye.